When death came, James Connolly couldn't even stand to meet it. A severe ankle wound sustained during the 1916 Easter Rising had turned gangrenous, leaving him unable to move. The British authorities, furious after the rebellion, were adamant he must be executed. But how do you execute a man who cannot stand? They solved the problem by bringing a chair into the courtyard of Kilmainham jail. The greatest irony was that the man being executed for Irish patriotism was a Scottish immigrant. Born in the slums of Edinburgh, he was a true outsider. Yet it was this outsider who did what no one else dared. He founded the Irish Citizen Army to protect workers. He forged the ideology that national independence was meaningless without workers' liberation. And that was something the British Empire could not forgive. So how did a poor immigrant boy from Scotland become one of Ireland's greatest martyrs? James Connolly was born on June 5th, 1868. He was not born in Ireland. He was born in the Cowgate slum of Edinburgh, Scotland. In the 19th century, this area was known, without a trace of irony, as Little Ireland. It was not a neighborhood. It was a ghetto. Cowgate is a deep man-made ravine in the center of the city, a narrow dark crevice where the high teetering tenement buildings choked off the sky. Sunlight was a rare visitor to the pavement. The air was thick with the coal smoke of the industrial city and the overpowering stench of human and animal waste. This was the destination for the survivors. His parents, John Connolly and Mary McGinn, were Irish immigrants. They were not adventurers seeking a new life. They were refugees fleeing a national catastrophe. They had escaped an Ireland hollowed out by Angorta Mór, the Great Famine, a holocaust of starvation and disease that had shattered the Irish people. They were survivors of a system that had, in just a few short years, seen millions die or flee, while food was actively exported under armed guard from their shores. They fled one hell and landed in another. In the Edinburgh of the 1870s, to be Irish was to be poor. To be poor was to be invisible, but to be Irish and Catholic was to be despised. Sectarianism was a fact of daily life. No Irish need apply was not just a hateful phrase. It was a fundamental pillar of the labor market. The Irish were pushed into the jobs no one else would take. The lowest, dirtiest, most dangerous, and worst-paying work. They were the navvies who built the canals, the laborers in the tanneries, the factory hands. John Connolly was a carter, a laborer who shoveled manure and other refuse for the city corporation. It was back-breaking, poorly paid work. The family lived, like all their neighbors, in a single, damp room in a tenement. These buildings were labyrinths of human misery, entire families, parents, children, grandparents, crammed into one small, lightless space. Sanitation was abysmal, consistent with contemporary reports of communal overflowing privies in the yard. Disease was not a visitor. It was a permanent resident. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus swept through the tenements, and the infant mortality rate was staggering. Of John and Mary's children, James's older brother Thomas had died young. Death was as common and expected as the cold Scottish rain. This was the first cage that shaped James Connolly: poverty. From his earliest moments, he saw the world as a brutal, simple equation. There were those who owned and those who worked. Those who owned the factories, the print shops, and the land lived in the wide, clean avenues of Edinburgh's New Town. Those who worked, his family, his neighbors, lived in the squalid ravine of Cowgate, existing only to serve the owners, rewarded with just enough bread and gruel to stay alive and keep working. He saw his mother Mary fight a daily, losing battle to keep her children fed and her tiny room clean. He saw his father John come home exhausted, his body broken by the labor of the day, for a wage that barely covered the rent, he saw, with the cold clarity of a child, that the system was not broken. It was working exactly as designed. The second cage was nationality. He saw that within this pyramid of poverty, the Irish were at the very bottom. They were a colonized people in their own land, and a scorned underclass in this new one. They were mocked for their accents, which they tried to suppress. They were attacked for their Catholic faith, which they practiced in quiet defiance. They were seen as racially inferior, as lazy, as drunken, as dangerous. Connolly, growing up on the streets, learned to fight. He was small but tough, he had to be, and he learned very quickly who was holding the keys to both cages. It was the same entity, the British establishment, the Crown, the Empire. The men who owned the Edinburgh factories were part of the same system that owned the land in Ireland, the same system that had allowed his people to starve, the same system that was now exploiting his family in Scotland. This environment forged him. It stripped him of any childhood illusions. While other children were in school, Connolly was on the street, fighting, running errands, or scavenging his formal education at the local Catholic school. Was over by the time he was 10, possibly 11. The law said he should be in school, but the law did not put food on the table. His father's health was failing. James had to work. He found a job as a printer's devil at the Edinburgh Evening News. It was menial, dirty work, cleaning the ink rollers, fetching type, sweeping the floors. But in the clatter and roar and chemical smell of the press room, a new world opened up. He was surrounded, for the first time in his life, not by filth, but by words. And he began voraciously to read. He didn't have a tutor. He didn't have a school. He had the world's library, discarded in the proofs and papers of a print shop. He taught himself to read with a fierce, focused intensity. He devoured everything: newspapers, political pamphlets, cheap novels, history books. He worked in the print shop, then a bakery, then a tile factory. Each job was a dead end, but his nights were spent reading. He found the works of Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers. For a poor boy from Cowgate, this was not a dry, abstract economic theory. It was an X-ray. It was a diagnosis. It was a perfect, crystalline explanation for the sickness he saw all around him. It explained the single room, the dying children, the scorned accents, the power of the owners, and the weakness of the workers. But at 14, reading did not pay the bills. His father's health had collapsed, and James was briefly the family's main breadwinner. Poverty was not a theory. It was a predator, and it was closing in. He saw only one escape, one path to a steady wage and a roof over his head, one institution that would feed and clothe him. In 1882, James Connolly, not yet 15, walked into a British Army recruiting office. He lied about his name, calling himself James Reed. The reason he chose this specific alias remains a mystery to historians. He lied about his age, claiming to be 18. He took the king's shilling. James Connolly, the future revolutionary, the boy who understood Marx, joined the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Scots Regiment. He had, in an act of desperate survival, joined the very machine he would one day dedicate his life to destroying. The army promised an escape from poverty. What it delivered was an education in tyranny. In one of history's most profound and defining ironies, the British Army, after training the young Reed, posted Private James Connolly to Ireland. He spent the next 7 years of his life, from 1882 to 1889, stationed first in Cork and later in Dublin and other parts of the country. He was now the man in the red coat. He was the enforcer. He was the visible uniform symbol of the very imperial power he had identified as the jailer of his people. This was not a peaceful time. He had arrived in the midst of the land war, a brutal rolling conflict between destitute Irish tenant farmers and the Anglo-Irish landlords, who owned nearly all the land. The central tactic of the landlords, backed by British law and the British Army, was eviction. Connolly's job was to be the muscle. He stood guard, rifle on his shoulder, as part of the military force backing the Royal Irish Constabulary during evictions. He witnessed firsthand the process by which families, people just like his own parents, people who spoke with the same accent his parents had tried to hide, were thrown out onto the roadsides. He was a self-taught Marxist in the uniform of an imperial soldier, policing a colonized people. The internal conflict, the sheer cognitive dissonance must have been agonizing. He saw with his own eyes that the Irish problem was not a distant memory his parents spoke of. It was a living, breathing, violent system of economic and national oppression, and he was a cog in its gears. This experience crystallized his worldview. It burned away any lingering doubts. He saw that the Irish farmer, the Dublin slum dweller, and the Edinburgh carter were all victims of the same system. The enemy was the landlord, the factory owner, the banker, and the guardian of them all. The ultimate guarantor of this system of exploitation was the soldier in the red coat, his own coat. He despised the army. He despised the brutal, idiotic NCOs. He despised the dehumanizing drills, and he despised himself for being part of it. But he was trapped. He was bound for a long term of service. But something else happened in Dublin, something that would change his life and provide the catalyst for his escape. While on duty, he met a young woman named Lily Reynolds. Lily was in every way his opposite. She was a Protestant from County Wicklow, working as a domestic servant for a wealthy family. In the deeply, violently divided world of 19th century Ireland, their relationship was a quiet, profound rebellion in itself. He, the working class, slum-raised, secret socialist Catholic in a British uniform. She, the local Protestant domestic servant. Love between them was a transgression against all the established orders, class, religion, and politics. But they fell in love. In 1889, Connolly's regiment received its new orders. They were to be shipped to India, another jewel in the imperial crown. Another land held in bondage. Connolly had a choice to make. He could follow the army to India, cementing his role as an imperial enforcer for another decade, and lose Lily forever, or he could run. He didn't hesitate. He chose Lily. He chose freedom. He chose the life of an outlaw. Sometime in late 1889, Private James Connolly deserted the British Army. This was no small decision. Desertion was a capital offense, punishable by death, though more often by a long prison sentence. He walked away from his barracks. Shedding his uniform and his false name, he was now a fugitive. He fled back to Scotland, to Dundee, where he sent for Lily. She followed him without hesitation, leaving her home and her religion behind for this intense, impoverished, and dangerous man. They were married in April 1890. He was now 22 years old. He was a deserter, a husband, and soon to be a father. He had no trade, no money, and a burning, all-consuming sense of injustice. He returned to Edinburgh with Lily, taking up the name Connolly again. He had to find work. He did what his father had done. He became a carter, a municipal laborer, shoveling manure. He was back, it seemed, exactly where he had started, in the slums of Edinburgh, at the bottom of the pyramid, living a life of grinding poverty. But everything had changed. The boy who had joined the army to escape was gone. In his place was a man who had seen the machine from the inside. He had been the enforcer. He had seen the evictions. He had worn the uniform. He had deserted. He was no longer just a victim of the system. He was its declared enemy. He threw himself into the only thing that made sense: the only movement that gave a voice to his rage and an outlet for his intellect. The socialist movement, he joined the Scottish Socialist Federation, SSF. He was a natural. He was not a drawing room socialist, an intellectual who theorized about the poor. He was the poor. He was the authentic voice of the exploited, and his mind was sharper than any university-trained debater. He began to speak on soapboxes, on street corners, in public parks. People were startled. They expected a fiery, ranting orator. Instead, they found a small, reserved man with a soft-spoken Scottish accent who, with clinical, devastating precision, dismantled the arguments of capitalism. He was a natural organizer. He wasn't just a talker, he was a doer. He became a key figure in the SSF, the secretary of its Edinburgh branch. He wrote pamphlets. He organized workers. He spent his days shoveling manure and his nights in libraries or on soapboxes, honing the arguments that would one day shake an empire. He was in these years forging the core of his great idea. He was a man of two identities. He was a Scottish socialist in a Scottish movement, but he was also an Irishman whose political awakening had happened on Irish soil. By 1896, his reputation as a brilliant, dedicated, and utterly incorruptible organizer had grown. His name was known in socialist circles beyond Scotland. An invitation came from across the sea. It came from Dublin. The Dublin Socialist Society was a small, struggling group of thinkers. They were looking for a full-time paid organizer. The pay was a paltry sum, barely enough to live on, let alone support his growing family. But it was a chance. It was a chance to return to the land that had defined him. It was a chance to stop shoveling manure and start building a revolution. In 1896, James Connolly, his wife Lily, and their young children moved to Dublin, the city he had once policed as an imperial soldier. This time, he was returning as a revolutionary. He was no longer an enforcer of the crown. He was a paid organizer for a revolution, albeit a very small one. The Dublin Socialist Society, his new employers, was a tiny, earnest group of intellectuals. They were a debating club. James Connolly had not come to debate. He had come to build. His poverty was immediate and crushing. The pound a week he was promised was often not there. His family was shuffled between squalid tenement rooms, a bitter echo of the Cowgate slum he thought he had left behind. But this poverty was a familiar fuel. Within days of his arrival, he assessed the situation and found it lacking. The society was passive. He wanted an army. He immediately, and with little regard for the sensibilities of his employers, disbanded their organization and in its place founded a new one, the Irish Socialist Republican Party, ISRP. The name itself was a declaration of war. In those 4 words, he had synthesized his entire life's experience: Irish Socialist Republican Party. It was a direct militant fusion of the two great warring ideas that had for a century ripped Irish revolutionary politics apart. To understand how radical this was, one must understand the Dublin of the 1890s. The revolutionary landscape was split into 2 hostile camps. On one side were the nationalists. These were the men who traced their lineage back to the physical force tradition of the Fenians. Their goal was singular: home rule, or, for the more militant, full independence from Britain. They spoke of the Irish language, of ancient Gaelic culture, of the soul of the nation. They were by and large socially conservative. They were poets, school teachers, and lawyers who dreamed of a tricolor flag flying over a Dublin parliament. They saw the socialists as a distraction, a dangerous, godless, foreign-born ism that would divide the nation. On the other side were the socialists. These were men, like his old colleagues in Scotland, who saw the world through the pure lens of class. They argued rightly that the Irish worker was exploited, but they saw the nationalist struggle as a bourgeois fraud. What they argued was the point of swapping an English boss for an Irish boss. What difference did it make if the man who owned your factory or your tenement was named Lord Smith or Mr. Murphy? The real enemy was capitalism. Nationalism to them was a false consciousness. These two camps despised each other. They saw each other as at best naive and at worst treacherous. James Connolly, the 28-year-old self-educated slum dweller, stood between these two Goliaths of Irish thought and declared that they were both wrong because they were both only half right. This was his grand unifying theory. He began in the pages of his brilliant, fiery, and perpetually broke newspaper, The Workers' Republic. From a drafty office, he set out his stall. To the nationalists, he delivered a stark warning. He said, in essence, you cannot have a free Ireland without a socialist Ireland. He warned them that if they achieved their dream, if they kicked the British Army out, but left the economic system of capitalism in place, they would have failed. They would have simply achieved the logical object of the Irish middle class. He argued, if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoist the green flag over Dublin Castle, unless you set about the organization of the Socialist Republic, your efforts will be in vain. And then he turned to his own socialist comrades, and what he said to them was even more heretical. His core argument, which set him apart, was that you cannot have a socialist revolution in a colony. He argued that a nation that is itself owned by another nation cannot possibly own its means of production. He laid it out with devastating practical logic. The British Empire, he explained, was the guardian of Irish capitalism. To break the chains of class, you must first break the chains of empire. The soldier, he knew from his own experience, was the ultimate protector of the capitalist. He argued that the Irish worker was oppressed in two ways, economically as a worker and nationally as an Irishman. To fight only one of these battles was to guarantee defeat. And then in the pages of the Workers' Republic, he condensed his entire philosophy into the most famous and most powerful sentence of his life: the cause of labor is the cause of Ireland. The cause of Ireland is the cause of labor. They cannot be separated. This was electrifying, and it was deeply threatening. He was attacking everyone. The establishment hated him because he was a socialist. The conservative nationalists hated him because he was a godless radical. And the dogmatic socialists hated him because he was tainted by nationalism. He was, in short, a man on an island. The ISRP was tiny, perhaps a few dozen members at its peak. The Workers' Republic was printed on a shoestring, often by Connolly himself, and was constantly folding due to lack of funds. But he didn't just write. He acted. He was an agitator. In 1897, as the British Empire prepared to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, a tide of imperial fervor swept Dublin. Connolly saw it as a celebration of 60 years of imperial crime. The ISRP was the only group in all of Ireland to organize a counter-demonstration. When the Boer War broke out in 1899, he was ferocious in his opposition. While mainstream nationalists were ambivalent, Connolly saw it clearly. It was an imperialist-capitalist war. He printed pamphlets urging Irishmen not to enlist, an act of open sedition. But his life was one of relentless, soul-crushing poverty. He had 6 children now, and some days they simply did not have food. His daughter Nora would later write of him standing on a street corner in Dublin, trying to sell copies of the Workers' Republic, his brilliant world-changing essays, for a penny, just to buy a loaf of bread for his family's dinner. He was a brilliant theorist, a man who could debate economics with the best in the world, but he couldn't feed his children. In 1902, he undertook a speaking tour of the United States a year later. In 1903, defeated and heartbroken, James Connolly did what so many of his countrymen had done before him. He gave up. He disbanded the failing ISRP. He saw his great project, the fusion of nationalism and socialism, as a failure. He took his family, and he emigrated. He left Ireland, possibly for good, and set sail for America. He arrived in New York in 1903. He was a 35-year-old political refugee, an intellectual exile. He hoped for a new start. What he found was the same cage, just built on a grander, more brutal scale. If 19th century Dublin was a city of slow, creeping decay, early 20th century America was a nation of explosive, high-speed industrial capitalism. He settled his family in New York and later New Jersey, and found work as a factory hand, an insurance collector, a machine shop laborer. He was plunged directly into the furnace of American industrial life and was horrified by what he saw. He quickly fell in, however, with the most radical and most dangerous movement in the country, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, known to all as the Wobblies. The Wobblies were not like any other union. Their slogan was One Big Union. Their vision was a pure, raw form of socialism called syndicalism or industrial unionism. The idea was a direct evolution of his own. Their plan was simple and apocalyptic. Organize all workers into one big union. And then one day that one big union would call one big strike. The entire economy would stop, the trains would halt, the factories would go silent. And in that moment of total paralysis, the workers, already organized, would simply take over. This idea electrified Connolly. It was the practical mechanism for the revolution he had only been able to theorize about in Dublin. He threw himself into the IWW, becoming a paid organizer. He traveled the country, from New York to the Deep South, speaking, writing, and organizing. But his time in America was also marked by bitter academic feuds with other socialist leaders who he felt were too dogmatic, too top-down, and too divorced from the workers themselves. He was, once again, on the margins, working in a Singer sewing machine factory, his revolutionary dreams seemingly dashed. He was now over 40. He had spent 7 years in the American wilderness, and Ireland was pulling him back. In 1910, a new, powerful voice had risen in the Irish labor movement, a voice that was everything Connolly was not. His name was Jim Larkin. Larkin was a mountain of a man, a Liverpool-born Irishman with a thunderous voice and a magnetic, chaotic, and messianic personality. He was a born agitator. If Connolly was the intellectual, the theorist, the scalpel, Larkin was the bullhorn, the hurricane, the battering ram. Larkin had read Connolly's works. He understood the power of industrial unionism, and he had founded a new union on that very model, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, ITGW. The ITGW was not for the skilled craftsmen. It was for the people Connolly came from, the dockers, the carters, the factory hands, the men who lived and died in the Dublin slums. It was, in effect, Connolly's IWW, reborn on Irish soil. Larkin and the other Irish socialists knew they needed more than just Larkin's thunder. They needed a brain. They needed an organizer. They needed a theorist. They needed Connolly. They sent him an invitation. Come home, and be the national organizer for the ITGW in 1910. James Connolly accepted. He left America, returning to Ireland. He was not the defeated émigré who had fled in 1903. He was a seasoned 42-year-old revolutionary, his mind sharpened by the intellectual wars of American socialism, his theory of revolution now complete. His first posting was not Dublin. It was the Lion's Den. Larkin sent him to Belfast. Belfast was the industrial heart of Ireland, a city of massive shipyards where the Titanic was being built, linen mills, and factories. It was also the dark, bloody heart of sectarianism. The bosses of Belfast, the Protestant Unionist establishment, had perfected the art of divide and rule. They kept the working class weak by setting Protestant and Catholic workers against each other. They used religious hatred as a tool to break strikes and keep wages low. Connolly waded directly into this carnival of reaction, as he called it. His message was simple and suicidal. To the Protestant workers who screamed, "Home rule is Rome rule," and to the Catholic workers who saw their Protestant neighbors as the enemy, he said, "You are both fools." He told them that sectarianism was a disease, a weapon of the employers. He stood on soapboxes between the hostile Catholic and Protestant slums and told them that the orange boss and the green boss were both robbing them blind. He famously wrote that the worker, who was a sectarian, was a slum dweller in his mind, a dupe of the oppressor. He was fighting on two fronts, against the bosses and against the centuries of religious hatred they exploited. It was here, in Belfast, that he saw the future, and it terrified him. The British government, to appease the Unionists, was beginning to float the idea of partition, cutting the northern counties out of a future Ireland. Connolly was horrified. He saw it as a catastrophe. He argued prophetically that partition would be a crime against the unity of the Irish nation and would destroy the Irish labor movement. He knew that a permanent border would permanently divide the working class. In 1912, he achieved a major goal. At the Irish Trade Union Congress, he put forward the resolution that created the Irish Labour Party. By 1913, all the pieces were in place. James Connolly had finally built his machine. He now stood at the head of the two arms of his revolution, just as he had dreamed. He had the industrial arm, the ITGWU, the one big union model to fight the economic battle, and he had the political arm, the Irish Labour Party, to fight the electoral battle. And in 1913, he moved from Belfast to Dublin to assist Jim Larkin with a dispute that would become the single greatest industrial battle in Irish history. The city of Dublin was a powder keg. A single man, the most powerful capitalist in Ireland, was about to light the fuse. That spark had a name: William Martin Murphy. Murphy was the perfect, almost novelistic embodiment of the very thing Connolly had warned about in 1896. He was not an English lord. He was an Irishman. He was a devout Catholic. He was a former Home Rule MP. He was the living, breathing proof of Connolly's thesis that an Irish boss would be just as ruthless, if not more so, than a British one. Murphy was the king of Irish capitalism. He owned the Irish Independent newspaper, the most powerful voice in the country. He owned the Imperial Hotel. He owned a vast network of businesses. And most critically, he owned the Dublin United Tramway Company. He was, in effect, the man who moved the city and the man who told the city what to think. And he saw Jim Larkin's Irish Transport and General Workers Union, Connolly's one big union, not as a labor organization, but as a disease, a form of terrorism. He decided to destroy it. The confrontation began simply. Murphy demanded that all employees of his tramway company sign a pledge to resign from the ITGWU and never to join it again. The workers refused. On August 26, 1913, Murphy's company locked them out of their jobs. This was the challenge Larkin and Connolly had been waiting, for in response other union members struck in sympathy. Larkin, in his element, delivered thunderous, messianic speeches. Murphy, cold and calculating, escalated. He formed a federation of 400 of the city's main employers. He convinced them all to issue the same pledge. Suddenly, 20,000 workers were locked out of their jobs with no pay. It was a perfect, brutal symmetry. The one big union had been met by the one big boss. The Dublin lockout had begun. It would last for 5 agonizing months. It was a war of attrition, and Murphy's goal was simple: to starve the workers, their wives, and their children into total, unconditional submission. Connolly was not the orator that Larkin was. While Larkin was the bullhorn, Connolly was the general, the strategist, the organizer. He ran the strike committee. He managed the distribution of food from a workers' kitchen in Liberty Hall, the union's headquarters. But the establishment was not neutral. It was terrified of Larkinism, and it saw the strikers not as citizens, but as an insurrection. The police, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, DMP, were controlled by the British administration in Dublin Castle, which in turn was allied with Murphy's class. They acted as Murphy's private army. The mask of law and order slipped on Sunday, August 31st, 1913. The day became known as Dublin's Bloody Sunday. Larkin, who had been banned by the police from speaking in public, announced he would address a rally in O'Connell Street regardless. The street was flooded with thousands of workers and onlookers, and it was ringed by hundreds of DMP and Royal Irish Constabulary, all armed with heavy wooden batons. In a moment of pure theater, Larkin, who had been smuggled into Murphy's own Imperial Hotel, appeared on a balcony in disguise, pulled off his beard, and roared his defiance before being arrested. This was the signal. The police charged. It was not a crowd dispersal. It was a pogrom. The police, whipped into a frenzy by their officers, charged the unarmed, trapped crowd. They did not use the flat of their batons. They used the ends like clubs. They cracked skulls. They beat men, women, and children indiscriminately. They charged into the side streets and even into the tenements. Hundreds were injured, their blood staining the cobblestones of Dublin's main street. One man, James Nolan, was beaten so severely by the police that he died. Another, John Byrne, died later from his injuries. Connolly was horrified but not surprised. This was what he had been trying to explain for 20 years. This was the state the police, the law, revealed as nothing more than the armed guardian of capitalist property. Connolly, too, was arrested. He was charged with incitement to sedition. In jail, he immediately did what the suffragettes had made famous. He declared a hunger strike. It was one of the first and most high-profile hunger strikes by an Irish political prisoner. He was weak, but his will was iron. After 8 days, the authorities, terrified of creating a martyr, released him. The lockout dragged on into the bitter cold of winter. The city was starving. The British Trade Union Congress, TUC, in a crucial meeting, voted not to support the Dublin strikers with full-scale sympathetic strikes across the UK. They offered money, but they would not stop the transport of goods, which would have won the strike. By early 1914, the Great Dublin Lockout, the most epic industrial battle in Irish history, was over. It was a bitter, agonizing defeat. Starving, broken, and with no hope left, the 20,000 workers began to drift back to their jobs. Many were forced to sign the hated pledge renouncing the union. The ITGWU was shattered. Jim Larkin, exhausted, defeated, and facing legal action, left for a speaking tour in America, a journey from which he would not return for almost a decade. James Connolly was left alone in the smoking ruins of his movement. He was now the acting general secretary of a broken union, the leader of a defeated political party, and the commander of a starving, demoralized working class. But the lockout was not just an end. It was a beginning. It was a christening. It had been a failure as a strike, but it had been a profound success as an education it had taught Connolly and all of Dublin one final, indelible lesson. It taught them that the establishment was one single, unified entity. The bosses, Murphy, the state and its police, the DMP, the press, the independent, and even the moral authority of the church were all in the final analysis on the same side. They were all on the side of property over people. And that unified establishment had guns, batons, and jails. The workers had, in the end, nothing. Out of that defeat, something new was born. During the lockout, Connolly, Larkin, and an ex-British Army captain named Jack White, a Protestant Ulster veteran, in another great irony, had an idea. If the police were going to beat unarmed workers in the street, the workers would have to learn to defend themselves. They formed a workers' militia. They called it the Irish Citizen Army, ICA. At first it was just a few hundred men with armbands, wooden batons, and hurleys, the sticks used in Irish hurling. They drilled in the fields outside Dublin and marched to protect workers' rallies. But after the lockout, with Larkin gone, James Connolly took sole command of the ICA, and this ex-British Army soldier, the man who had deserted, began to forge it into something new. He was no longer training a defense corps. He was training a revolutionary army. He drilled them relentlessly. He taught them military tactics, marksmanship, and urban warfare. He, the man who had faced poverty his whole life, became a fundraiser and used the money to buy them modern, high-powered Mauser rifles, which they smuggled into the country. The ICA was unique in the world. It was not a nationalist army. It was a socialist army. Its headquarters was Liberty Hall, the Union Building. Its constitution declared its first principle to be the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. It was the first army in Europe to have full, equal membership and officers for women, like Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Countess Markievicz. Connolly gave it its own flag, the Starry Plough, a symbol of a new socialist Ireland where the plough, the tool of the worker, would be placed among the stars. And on a massive banner that hung from Liberty Hall, he emblazoned its defiant internationalist and anti-imperialist slogan, a direct message to the two forces that were about to tear the world apart. We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. By 1914, James Connolly was no longer just a theorist. He was the acting general secretary of the ITGWU, the leader of the Labour Party, and most importantly, the commandant of the Irish Citizen Army, a small, disciplined, well-armed, and fiercely loyal socialist army, his personal army, in the middle of Dublin. He was a king in all but name in the ruins of the Dublin slums. He was building his strength. He was waiting. And then, in August 1914, an archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo. The world that James Connolly had known his entire life was about to be burned to the ground, and he, for one, was ready to light a match. The outbreak of the First War in August 1914 was not just a political event. For James Connolly, it was a crisis of faith. It was the moment the world he was trying to build and the tools he was using to build it were burned to the ground. It was the single decisive catalyst that would turn him from a union organizer who happened to have a small army into a hardline, single-minded military revolutionary, a man in a desperate hurry to light a fire even if it consumed him. For decades, the great socialist parties of Europe had been building a fortress of international working-class solidarity. The Second International, a global federation of socialist and labor parties, had held Congress after Congress, and at every one they had made a single sacred and unambiguous pledge: they would never, ever support an imperialist war. They saw the coming conflict for what it was, a cabinet war, a grotesque, cynical squabble between the crowned heads and capitalist cliques of Europe. They pledged that if these masters declared war, the working classes of Europe would not march. They would respond with a general strike. This was the foundational promise of 20th century international socialism, and James Connolly believed in it. Then came August 1914, and the promise evaporated like smoke. One by one, the great socialist parties, the parties of Marx and Engels, collapsed in a heap of patriotic fervor. In Germany, the SPD, the largest and most powerful socialist party in the world, voted in the Reichstag to approve the Kaiser's war credits. In France, the socialists joined the Union Sacrée, the sacred union, with their own government. In Britain, the Labour Party fell in line to James Connolly, watching the telegraphed reports come in at Liberty Hall. This was not just a political failure. It was the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. He was incandescent with a rage that was part disgust and part despair. He watched in visceral horror as millions of working-class men, miners from Wales, factory hands from the Ruhr, and peasants from France, put on uniforms, picked up rifles, and marched off with banners flying and bands playing to slaughter each other in the mud of Flanders. It was, he wrote, the greatest crime of the ages. His response was immediate and scathing. He saw that the war was not only a tragedy, but an opportunity the socialists had criminally wasted. He wrote one of his most famous and most bitter passages. If these men must die, would it not be better to die in their own country fighting for freedom for their class than to die in Flanders fighting for the slug-like supremacy of the British Empire? The betrayal was not just international, it was local, it was Irish. Just as the European socialists betrayed their class, the Irish nationalists, in Connolly's eyes, betrayed their nation. John Redmond, the leader of the powerful mainstream Irish Parliamentary Party, stood up in the British House of Commons, and in a speech that would seal his fate and the fate of his party, pledged the full support of the Irish nation to the British war effort. He offered the Irish Volunteers, a nationalist militia that dwarfed Connolly's tiny ICA, as a tool of the British Empire. To Connolly, this was the final sickening joke. He was now utterly, terrifyingly isolated. The international socialists had joined their Kaisers. The Irish nationalists had joined their king. He was a man on an island. He had his broken union, his few hundred ICA men, and his newspaper. He looked at the carnival of reaction sweeping the world, and he made a decision. If the socialists of Europe would not rise up, he would. If the great international general strike was dead, then a small national insurrection would have to do. He decided that if the world was determined to drown itself in blood for the sake of empires, he would make sure that some of that blood was shed for freedom. This was his new stark post-betrayal reality. He was done with resolutions and congresses. The time for theory was over. The time for military action was now, and he began to act. While the rest of Dublin was a flurry of British recruitment, James Connolly turned Liberty Hall into an open military headquarters. He, the ex-British Army soldier, began to drill his 200-strong Irish citizen army with a relentless public and suicidal intensity. He was not discreet. He was provocative. He marched his men in their dark green uniforms, rifles on their shoulders, through the streets of Dublin in broad daylight. And in the pages of his relaunched newspaper, The Workers' Republic, he published what can only be described as an open-source manual for insurrection. He, the commandant of the ICA, wrote articles on street fighting, a series that was studied with close interest by the British authorities. He analyzed the lessons of the 1905 Moscow Rising. He explained in print to his followers and to the police the strategic value of urban warfare, how to use snipers' nests, how to tunnel between houses, how to use explosives, how to seize and fortify key buildings. He was, in effect, screaming his battle plan from the rooftops. His daughter Nora would later recall him poring over maps of Dublin, pointing, "We can hold that here, we can take that there." He was not hoping for a rising, he was planning one. The British authorities in Dublin Castle watched him with a mixture of amusement and irritation. They saw him as a gassy socialist crank. They didn't take him seriously, but someone else was watching, and they took him very seriously. This brings us to the great controversy of James Connolly's life, the moment that, for his critics, defines and damns him. There was another revolutionary group in Ireland. This group was the polar opposite of Connolly. Where he was public, they were secret. Where he was a socialist, they were nationalists. Where he was a realist, they were mystics. They were the Irish Republican Brotherhood, IRB. The IRB was the secret oath-bound society that was the direct descendant of the Fenians. They were the true physical force tradition. For them, there was no economic theory. There was only one goal, an independent Irish republic, to be achieved by force of arms. Their leaders were men like Tom Clark, the old revered Fenian, who had served 15 years in a British prison, and Sean MacDiarmada, the brilliant, ruthless organizer. And they had a new, younger generation of leaders, men like Patrick Pearse. Pearse was a school teacher, a poet, and a Gaelic revivalist. He was a romantic mystic who believed in the blood sacrifice, the quasi-religious idea that a generation of heroes must shed its blood, must martyr itself to reawaken the sleeping soul of the Irish nation. These men, Pearse, Clark, MacDiarmada, were not socialists. They were, by and large, conservative, middle-class, Catholic nationalists. They had no interest in Connolly's cooperative commonwealth. They wanted a flag, a parliament, and the English gone. And since the outbreak of the war, this secret IRB military council had been planning its own rising. They were secretly drilling their own much larger army, the Irish Volunteers. They were secretly negotiating with Germany, trying to land a massive shipment of weapons. Their plan was a national insurrection, time for Easter, 1916. And they looked at James Connolly, the loud-mouthed public socialist crank, with absolute terror. He was a liability. He was a loose cannon. He was drilling his men in public. He was publishing his battle plans. They were terrified that this madman of Liberty Hall was going to jump the gun. They feared he would start some half-baked premature rising with his tiny 200-man army, which would fail instantly, but would trigger a massive British crackdown. This crackdown, they knew, would roll up their own secret network. He, with his disciplined but tiny ICA of just over 200 men, would, in his suicidal impatience, ruin the planned national rising of the volunteers, who numbered in the thousands. Connolly, for his part, held them in equal contempt. He saw the IRB and their nationalist allies as armchair revolutionaries. He mocked their obsession with dead generations. He saw them as poets who spoke in the past tense, who had no understanding of the working class, no economic program, and, as far as he could tell, no real plan to actually fight. The two forces, the socialist and the nationalist, were on a collision course. The tension broke in January 1916. The IRB Military Council could wait no longer. They had to get control of Connolly. They had to silence him or join him, so they kidnapped him. It wasn't a violent abduction. A pivotal and still mysterious event occurred. The IRB leaders desperate to control him, invited Connolly to a secret meeting. He then vanished. He was held incommunicado for 3 days. No one knew where he was. His friends and family were frantic. At Liberty Hall, his second-in-command, Michael Mallon, was convinced the IRB had kidnapped or assassinated their leader. The Irish citizen army was armed and mobilized. They were, in that moment, preparing to go to war, not against the British Empire, but against the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But in that secret room, a kidnapping was turning into a negotiation for 3 days. The two sides argued. It was one of the most consequential and entirely unminuted meetings in Irish history. It was the showdown. It was Patrick Pearse, the poet and the IRB counsel, versus James Connolly, the Marxist. It was the nationalist versus the socialist. They laid out their plans. The IRB, likely Pearse himself, explained their vision: the blood sacrifice, the national rising, the secret negotiations with Germany. And when James Connolly emerged, 3 days later, he was a changed man. His friends at Liberty Hall were shocked. He looked pale and transformed, but with a strange, new happiness in his eyes. He had made a deal. He had agreed to a joint rising at Easter. He, the International Socialist, was sworn into the secret nationalist Irish Republican Brotherhood. He was co-opted onto its military council. He was, in effect, now one of the secret leaders of the very movement he had spent his life criticizing. For this, his socialist critics, then and now, have never forgiven him. This was to them his great betrayal. The international socialist press was baffled. Lenin, in Russia, initially dismissed the coming rebellion as a putsch. Connolly's critics accused him of abandoning his life's work. They said he had been seduced by Pearse's blood-red mystical nationalism. They claimed he had traded his clear-eyed materialist Marxism for a romantic Gaelic death wish. He had betrayed his class for a flag, but they misunderstood him. They misunderstood the man, the calculation, and the desperation of the moment. Connolly hadn't been seduced. He had made a cold, hard, strategic calculation. He was, above all, a pragmatist. First, there was the military reality. He looked at his 200 ICA men. He looked at the 1,500 or so IRB-controlled volunteers in Dublin. He knew he was too weak to act alone. His public rising was a bluff. Now he had a real army. Second, he saw this as the only path left. The great betrayal of 1914 had taught him that the international socialist movement was dead. He believed passionately that the war was a monstrous crime and that someone had to be the first to break the line, to light a fire. He saw the Irish rising not as a blood sacrifice, but as the first shot in a European-wide anti-war, anti-imperialist revolution. He hoped that a blow against the British Empire in Dublin might inspire the German socialists or the French to finally rise up and do the same. Third, and most importantly, he believed he was using them just as much as they were using him. He was arrogant in his own way. He was certain of the intellectual superiority of his socialist republican idea. He saw the rising as a two-stage rocket. Stage 1. Use the nationalist guns, manpower, and romantic fervor to achieve the first necessary goal: break the connection with the British Empire. Get the British out. Stage 2. After the British were gone, in the new independent Ireland, the real battle would begin. And in that battle, his idea, the organized, armed, and intellectually coherent socialist republic, would inevitably defeat the vague, romantic, Gaelic state of the poets. He hadn't abandoned socialism. He was trying to give it a gun, and he had proof. The deal was not unconditional. He forced his socialist principles directly into the heart of their nationalist revolution. When the proclamation of the Irish Republic was drafted, it was Connolly, the Marxist, who was the driving force behind its most radical and enduring lines that declared the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. This was pure Connolly. This was not a nationalist sentiment. It was a socialist one. It was a direct claim on the means of production, lines that guaranteed religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens, and that the new republic would cherish all the children of the nation equally. This was his answer to the sectarianism of Belfast and the class warfare of the lockout. This was not a bourgeois document. This was, for 1916, a revolutionary social democratic and deeply feminist charter. He had not betrayed his cause. He had injected it into the DNA of the new republic. By April 1916, the deal was done. The alliance was forged. The man from the Cowgate slums, the ex-British soldier, the industrial unionist, the socialist theorist, and the nationalist rebel were now one and the same. He was about to march his tiny Irish citizen army out of Liberty Hall to rendezvous with the poets and the shopkeepers of the IRB. He was about to give the order to seize the center of Dublin, and in doing so, to strike the first armed blow against a major European empire in the midst of the Great War. The story of Easter 1916 is one of chaos, contradiction, and catastrophic miscalculation. And at the heart of it all stands James Connolly, the one man who seemed in that week to know exactly what he was doing. The entire rising was almost stillborn. The secret IRB plan had depended on two things: a massive shipment of German arms, 20,000 rifles on a ship called the Aoud, and the mobilization of the entire Irish volunteers, their national militia, under the cover of public maneuvers on Easter Sunday. In the days leading up to Easter, both pillars collapsed. The Aoud was intercepted by the Royal Navy and scuttled by its own captain. The German arms were at the bottom of the sea. Then, Ian McNeill, the official leader, or chief of staff of the Irish Volunteers, who was not a member of the secret IRB plot, discovered the conspiracy at the last minute. He was horrified. He saw a plan for a national rising without the promised German arms as a crime and a suicide. On Saturday, April 22nd, McNeill did the only thing he thought he could do to save the country. He placed a countermanding order in the Sunday newspapers, canceling all maneuvers by the Irish Volunteers for Sunday. This was checkmate. The rising was over. The IRB's secret plot was exposed, its arms were gone, and its army had just been ordered to stay home. For Pierce Clark and the other IRB leaders, it was a moment of total, crushing despair. But they had not reckoned with James Connolly. When the news of McNeill's countermand reached Liberty Hall, the IRB leaders found Connolly not in despair, but in a state of cold, settled fury. He had spent his entire life being let down by men who talked a revolution but would not act one. His position was simple, and he delivered it to the IRB Council with the force of an ultimatum. We go out. We are going out on Monday. Even if it is just the ICA, we will go out by ourselves and strike the first blow. He accused the volunteers of cowardice. He famously said to Pierce, "We have been sold, but I am glad. We, the ICA, will go out even if we are only 200, and we will set a marker for the future. We will redeem Dublin's honor." This was the final spur Connolly's iron will, his absolute refusal to be sold. Again, shamed and galvanized the IRB leaders. They could not be seen to be less brave than the socialists. The decision was made. The rising was off for Sunday, but it was on for Monday. They would not mobilize the whole country. They would mobilize only the men they could trust, the IRB loyal battalions in Dublin. It would not be a national insurrection. It would be a city center coup demain. And because it was now a desperate urban military action, there was only one man to lead it. Patrick Pearse, the man who would be president of the new republic, signed the order. James Connolly, the ex-British Army private, the street-fighting theorist, was made Commandant General of the Dublin Division. He was, in effect, the supreme military commander of the entire 1916 Easter Rising. The socialist had not just joined the nationalists, he was now their general. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, the air in Dublin was bright and clear. It was a bank holiday. The city was relaxed. Crowds of Dubliners, dressed in their Sunday best, were heading to the beaches or to the races at 10 a.m. at Liberty Hall. James Connolly gathered his Irish citizen army. They were immaculate in their dark green uniforms, their bayonets fixed. Their discipline was a stark contrast to the arriving volunteers who came in a mix of uniforms and civilian clothes. "This is the day," he told them. "We are going out to fight for Irish freedom, for the full freedom of Ireland and of all its people. In the event of victory, hold on to your rifles, as those with rifles will be the ones who will be listened to in the event of defeat. Well, we will go down fighting." At noon, the order was given. The doors of Liberty Hall were flung open. The combined force of the ICA and the volunteers, the headquarters battalion, marched out. The column was a strange, surreal sight. At its head walked the leaders. There was Pearse, the poet, in his immaculate uniform, sword in hand. There was Tom Clark, the 58-year-old Fenian, his life's purpose finally realized. There was Joseph Plunkett, a poet so ill with tuberculosis he could barely walk. And then there was Connolly. He was not in a dream. He was at work. He marched alongside his men, his small, solid frame a picture of military precision. Bemused Dubliners on their holiday watched them pass. Laughter and mockery followed them. "Look at the tin soldiers," some shouted. Their target was just a few blocks away, the General Post Office, GPO. The GPO was not just a post office. It was the nerve center of British communication in Ireland. It was a massive stone fortress of a building, a symbol of imperial power and modernity, standing in the middle of Dublin's widest street. At 12:45 p.m., the column halted. Connolly barked the order. The rebels stormed the building. They smashed in the doors and windows with their rifle butts. Inside, the post office was full of customers and staff. They looked up in stunned disbelief as men with rifles and bandoliers screamed at them to get out, get out. The building was cleared in minutes. The tricolor flag and a new green flag bearing the words Irish Republic were hoisted on the roof. Patrick Pearse, as president, walked outside onto the portico. To a small, confused, and mostly indifferent crowd of onlookers, he read the Proclamation of the Irish Republic, the document Connolly had helped to write, the document that declared the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland. A few people cheered. Most were baffled. But inside the GPO, the play acting was over. James Connolly, the Commandant General, got to work. He was not a poet. He was a soldier. He knew that the British would not be beaten by a single beautifully read document. They would be beaten by well-aimed rifle fire. His command was so total, so practical, that it stunned the nationalists who had only known him as a socialist talker. He was, one volunteer later said, the only man in that building who knew what he was doing. While others were making speeches or overcome with the emotion of the moment, Connolly was sighting rifles. He was a whirlwind of practical energy, organizing the fortification of the most undefendable building in Dublin. "Smash the windows," he commanded. "Barricade them." He directed the men to build barricades, not of flimsy wood, but of the massive, heavy cloth mailbags, which he knew were excellent at stopping bullets. He planned the snipers' nests. He organized the firing lines. He set up a makeshift hospital. He was, in short, conducting a master class in the very street fighting he had been writing about for a year. The first few days were a strange, euphoric success. The British were completely caught by surprise. The rebels had seized not just the GPO, but a half-dozen other key locations across the city. The British first response was weak and panicked. They sent a column of lancers, cavalry, trotting down O'Connell Street. Connolly from the GPO watched them come. He let them get close. Then he gave the order to fire. The volley from the GPO was devastating. Horses and men screamed and fell. The cavalry, a relic of an old war, broke and fled from the new modern warfare of the fortified building. But Connolly was not cheering. He was a realist. He knew what was coming. The British were not going to retake the GPO. This was 1916. This was the era of the Great War. They were going to use the tools of the Great War. They were going to level the city center. They began by forming a cordon. They sealed off the north of the city, bringing in thousands of troops, and then they brought in the artillery. On Wednesday, the sound began. A high screaming whine, followed by a ground-shaking crump. They had sailed a gunboat, the HMS Helga, up the River Liffey, and it began, from a mile away, to shell Liberty Hall, the symbol of the Revolution, blowing it to pieces. Then they brought 18-pounder field guns to Trinity College at the end of the street, and they began to methodically, clinically shell the GPO. The atmosphere inside the post office turned from euphoria to hell. The noise was constant, a deafening, skull-rattling roar. The building was shaking so hard that plaster fell in great choking clouds from the ceiling. The massive stone facade was being pulverized shot by shot, and then came the fire. The shells were incendiary. The surrounding buildings, one by one, caught fire. O'Connell Street was transformed into a blazing, roaring inferno. The heat from the fires outside was so intense it began to crack the windows of the GPO. But James Connolly was still in command. He was tireless. He seemed to be everywhere at once, moving from post to post, his quiet, calm voice reassuring his men. "It's okay, lads. Hold your positions." He would walk out into the open, exposed positions to check on his men, to give a word of encouragement. It was this courage that would be his downfall. On Thursday, April 27th, the fourth day of the rising, the GPO was beginning to burn. Connolly was directing operations, moving between the GPO and the outposts he had set up in the surrounding streets. He had already been hit once, a bullet to his arm. He had it bandaged and carried on. He moved to an exposed position on the street, directing his men to move a barricade. A sniper from the rooftops had him in his sights. A volley rang out. Connolly fell. A single bullet, or perhaps a ricochet from the pavement, slammed into his left ankle. It was not a clean wound. The high-velocity bullet hit the bone and shattered it, pulverizing the ankle and driving fragments of his boot and stocking deep into the wound. The pain was immediate, blinding, and absolute. His men rushed to him. He was carried, his face gray and beaded with sweat, back into the GPO. They laid him on a stretcher in the main hall. The medics looked at the wound and knew this was not a wound you walk away from. This was a gas gangrene wound, but he was still the Commandant General. This is the central defining image of Connolly's rising. A man on a stretcher, his body broken, his leg a mass of bloody rags, but his mind as sharp and as cold as steel. He did not relinquish command. He could not. Patrick Pearse, the president, was a poet. Connolly was the soldier. From his stretcher, in excruciating, agonizing pain, James Connolly continued to command the battle for Dublin. He had himself propped up. He dictated orders. He demanded reports from the outposts. He directed troop movements. Pierce, in a dispatch, wrote in awe of him. He was still the guiding brain of our resistance. He is wounded, but his spirit is greater than ever. But by Friday, the GPO was no longer a fortress. It was a burning, collapsing death trap. The roof was caving in. The main hall was a sea of fire. The heat was unbearable. The ammunition was cooking off in the flames. The rebels were trapped. Connolly, his leg now a septic, swollen mass, his body racked with fever, knew the fight in the GPO was over. He had to save his men. On his order, the evacuation began. It was a desperate, suicidal charge. They would break out of the back of the GPO, across a street that was swept by British machine gun fire, and into the houses on Moore Street. They carried Connolly on his stretcher, one of the first to be moved, shielding his body with their own. They ran, one by one, across the open ground, men falling as the machine guns ripped them apart. They made it. The surviving garrison crammed themselves into the small houses and shops of Moore Street. They began to burrow with picks and sledgehammers from house to house, a tactic Connolly himself had written about. They were now in a tiny besieged island with the British Army closing in. Connolly was laid on a bed in a back room, his leg now visibly poisoning him, the smell of gangrene filling the small space. He, Pierce, Clark, and the other leaders held a final council of war. They were in a trap. To their front, the British were waiting with machine guns. Behind them, the city was a sea of fire, and then they began to hear the screaming. They were in a civilian area. The British, believing the rebels were in the next block, were preparing to shell their block, a block full of trapped, terrified civilians. Patrick Pierce looked out a window and saw a family with a white flag, trying to flee, be cut down in the crossfire. That was the end. He turned to Connolly. Connolly, the pragmatist, the soldier, knew it was over. His fight was not a blood sacrifice. It was a military action, and that action had failed. To continue would be to do one thing and one thing only: to ensure the mass slaughter of his own men and the civilians they had, in theory, come to liberate from his bed. In agony, the Commandant General gave his last order. He concurred with Pierce. It was time to surrender. On Saturday, April 29, 1916, 6 days after they had stormed the GPO, Patrick Pierce walked out onto Moore Street under a white flag and surrendered unconditionally to the British. James Connolly, the last leader to be moved, was taken on his stretcher. He was carried out into the street, his eyes blinking in the sunlight, the first he had seen in a week. The captured rebels were marched through the streets. The reaction of the Dublin public, the very people they had proclaimed to liberate, was not one of gratitude. It was one of fury. Their city was destroyed. Their relatives were dead. The crowd spat on them. They threw refuse at them. They screamed for them to be shot. Connolly, on his stretcher, was separated from the rest. His wound was too severe. He was not taken to a prison. He was taken under heavy guard to a military hospital set up in a state apartment in Dublin Castle. He was now a prisoner of the Crown. His leg was septic. He was in constant, excruciating pain, and the British authorities, having failed to kill him in battle, now had to decide very quickly what to do with him. The rising was over. The retribution was about to begin. For 2 weeks, the British Empire conducted its retribution. While James Connolly lay in a state apartment in Dublin Castle, the very nerve center of the British rule, he had tried to smash. The executions began. The room he was held in was a bizarre gilded cage. He was a prisoner, but he was also a patient. His left leg, shattered at the ankle, was a ruined. Gangrene had set in almost immediately. The military surgeons, under orders, were not trying to save him. They were in a race against the infection. They had to keep him alive long enough for the firing squad. They performed a desperate, agonizing surgery, but they all knew it was hopeless. He was in constant, searing pain, his body racked with fever and delirium. Yet in his moments of lucidity, the men and women who guarded and tended to him were astonished. He was not a ranting Bolshevik monster. He was quiet, courteous, and possessed of a granite-like calm. He engaged his nurses in discussions of feminism and the labor movement. But the worst torture was not the pain. It was the sound. Every morning from his bed he could hear the distant muffled crack of the rifle volleys from Kilmainham jail, miles away. One by one, his comrades, his co-signatories, were being taken to the stonebreaker's yard and shot. May 3rd, Patrick Pearse, Tom Clark, Thomas McDonough. May 4th, Joseph Plunkett, Edward Daly, Michael O'Hanrahan, Willie Pierce. May 8th, Sean Houston. Michael Mallon, Connolly's second in command of the Irish Citizen Army. The man he had trained Connolly knew this. He lay in his bed, his leg rotting, and he listened to the drumbeat of extinction. He knew they were saving him. For last he was the big prize, the Commandant General, the dangerous socialist, the man who had given the rabble an army and an idea. On May 9th, 1916, the same day they shot Mallon, they came for him, but not with a stretcher. They came with a table and chairs. The court-martial was convened in his hospital room. It was a scene of pure imperial theater. 3 British officers sat at a makeshift table. James Connolly, propped up in his bed, his body so weak he could barely speak, was formally charged with sedition and levying war against the king. He was asked if he had anything to say. He did not offer a defense. He did not plead for his life. He knew the verdict was written before they had even entered the room. Instead, he dictated a final statement. It was his last great article, his final testament, delivered in a voice low and weak with pain, but with every sentence as precise and sharp as a scalpel. He was not a defendant. He was a lecturer, and he was putting the empire on trial. We believe that the British government has no right in Ireland, never had any right in Ireland, and never can have any right in Ireland. We went out to break the connection between this country and the British Empire and to establish an Irish republic. We believe that the call we then issued to the people of Ireland was a call to a rightful action. We have succeeded in proving that Irishmen are ready to die. The cause of Irish freedom is safe. It was over. The officers, in a grim formality, found him guilty and pronounced the sentence of death. On May 11th, the day before his execution, he was allowed to see his family one last time. First, his wife Lily was brought in. This was the woman who had followed him from Dublin to Dundee, from Edinburgh to America, and back. The woman who had endured a life of relentless, crushing poverty. She entered the room and saw not the Commandant General, but her husband, a broken, dying man in a hospital bed. She collapsed, her grief uncontrollable. James, in this final moment, had to be the strong one. He tried to comfort her. As the guards moved to separate them, she was clinging to him, and he whispered, his own resolve breaking, "Don't cry, Lily. You'll unman me." She was taken away. Then his eldest daughter, Nora, was allowed in. This was a different meeting. Nora was a fire-breathing revolutionary in her own right. She had been his companion, his student, his political partner. This was not the farewell of a husband. It was the final order of a commandant. He was clear, his mind focused. He knew exactly how history would view him. He knew his great betrayal of 1914, his alliance with the bourgeois nationalists, would be his most contested act, and he gave Nora and history his final defense. "The socialist," he said, his voice low but firm, "will not understand why I am here. They will all forget that I am an Irishman." In the cold, gray, pre-dawn hours of May 12, 1916, they came for him. The drumbeat of executions had stopped 2 days earlier. The British commander, General Maxwell, was facing growing political pressure from London and even from the king to stop the bloodbath, but he had insisted on 2 more, Sean Mac Diarmada, who was so crippled by polio he could barely walk, and Connolly. They could not make Connolly walk. They strapped him to a military ambulance stretcher. The journey from Dublin Castle to Kilmainham Jail was an agony, every jolt of the vehicle on the cobblestones sending white-hot, sickening waves of pain through his body. He arrived at the jail just as the first sickly gray light of dawn touched the high stone walls. They carried him into the stonebreaker's yard. The firing squad was already assembled, and then the final grotesque problem presented itself. The prisoner, brought from his hospital bed, couldn't stand. He was delirious with pain, his body a shattered septic ruin. He could not be placed against the wall like Pierce or Clark. The military execution required the condemned to stand. An officer was dispatched. He ran not to the infirmary but to a storage room. He returned with a simple wooden kitchen chair, a plain common chair. They carried James Connolly from the stretcher. They lifted his broken, fever-racked body and sat him in it. He slumped immediately, his head falling to his chest, his body too weak to hold itself upright. This would not do. The execution had to be proper. So they used rope and perhaps their own belts. They strapped him tightly to the back of the chair, lashing his arms and torso so that he was held erect. He faced the line of rifles, not on his feet as a defiant rebel, but bound to a piece of household furniture as a condemned broken man. A blindfold was offered. He refused it. A Catholic priest administered the last rites. Connolly, the secularist, the man who had battled the church his entire life, accepted them. He was, to the end, a man of contradictions. He reportedly spoke his final words to the firing squad: "I will pray for all the men who are about to do their duty." The officer gave the order. The volley rang out, but the execution was botched. The volley was not clean. He was slumped, a bleeding, ragged mess in the chair, but he was not instantly dead. The officer in charge, his duty paramount, drew his service pistol. He walked up to the slumped figure in the chair, placed the pistol to his head, and delivered the final close-range coup de grace. James Connolly was dead. The act was so grotesque, so barbaric, that it shocked the world. The execution of a man so badly wounded he had to be tied to a chair to be shot. This was the turning point. This was the moment General Maxwell's victory turned into a catastrophic political defeat. The public's anger at the rebels, the people who had spat on them a week before, instantly transformed into a wave of revulsion against the British. Maxwell had not crushed a rebellion. He had, in a single stupid act of bureaucratic cruelty, created a nation of martyrs. The story of Connolly in his chair was a parable. It was not law. It was not justice. It was murder. The man who had lived his life as an outsider, the Scottish-born socialist, the internationalist, the man who was too red for the nationalists and too green for the socialists, became, in his death, the most powerful nationalist symbol of all. His execution, and that of his comrades, was the spark that lit the Irish War of Independence. The blood sacrifice of the poets, sealed by the bureaucratic murder of the socialist, had worked. James Connolly, along with the other executed leaders, was buried in a mass grave at Arbor Hill Barracks. Their bodies were not returned to their families. They were buried in a mass grave at Arbor Hill Barracks. It was and is widely believed that their bodies were dissolved in quicklime, an ancient imperial tactic. They could not have been more wrong. James Connolly's legacy is, to this day, fiercely contested, and that is his ultimate power. His ghost does not rest. He is not a clean, simple monument. He is a living, breathing argument. The Irish nationalists claim him. They built a statue of him in his ICA uniform. They named Dublin's main train station in his honor. He is a signatory of the proclamation, a founding father, a sacred martyr who died for the green flag. The socialists, both in Ireland and around the world, claim him. They see him as a true revolutionary Marxist, a world-class theorist, the great anti-imperialist who taught Lenin. They see the nationalists as having appropriated their hero, sanitized him, and stripped him of his radical red ideas. They are both right, and they are both wrong. James Connolly, the man from the slums, the soldier, the theorist, and the martyr, died for the unshakable, fanatical belief that those two freedoms, the freedom of a nation and the freedom of its workers, were one and the same.